Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So, some of my numberless faithful fans have requested that I make a video about Jordan Peterson. Now, he's not someone I find intriguing, but I shall talk about Professor Peterson, as that's what people want. Give the people what they want. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. But enough about Brexit. Anyhow, Peterson is a Canadian professor of psychology. He teaches at Harvard at the moment. So how old is he now? He's 50-something? I think he's 57 if I got that right. Anyway, he was educated at the University of Alberta and McGill University. McGill is one of the most illustrious ones in Canada. He's worked as a clinical psychologist at hospitals. But he was all but unknown to the general public, and he burst onto the scene in 2013, setting up a YouTube channel to publish his lectures. And then only last year, he published 12 Rules for Life, which was a sensation. And this was a hit with the general reader, the sort of person who wouldn't usually dip into books on psychology. So he's well known as a public intellectual for opining on all sorts of issues which don't pertain to his field. So he's a controversialist, some would say a contrarian, and he didn't always think this way. 20 years ago, if you see clips of him then, he was singing a different tune, but that's to be expected. Very few people have exactly the same opinions all the way through their life. So it could be that someone has precisely the same views through his or her entire life and is an open-minded person. However, that's highly improbable. Anyway, Professor Peterson seems to address himself to young males, particularly white males, although he doesn't specifically say that, but he's taken issue with the notion of white privilege, and that tends to appeal to whites more than non-whites. He talks about the crisis of masculinity, saying that, certain jobs of going, heavy industry jobs, ones that made men feel macho, they could be horny-handed sons of toil. Deindustrialization has impacted on them, and they're often not married or in long-term relationships, and so they feel dispirited, dejected, as though the world doesn't need them anymore, talking about blue-collar men in particular, and not so many of them in the army, and they feel their culture's under threat. And he said this has led to the rise of Trumpism. And I think he's hit the nail on the head when he says that. The Me Too movement has affected straight males as well. What can I do? What's acceptable in terms of flirtation or making an advance? So some men are discombobulated by third-wave feminism. So Professor Peterson, well, what's his psychology? He's a phlegmatic sort, reflective, but he's no ivory tower intellectual, though he is a contemplative type. His delivery is always deadpan. I mean, not this is comedy, but he's courteous in the way he speaks, restrained. He speaks in almost a monotone, bland, almost languorous, his speech and his cadences. So despite being a prof, he's not too supercilious, and people like him, they can come across as haughty. He's not moralistic either, and I think that's a virtue, if that's not too much of an irony, refraining from moralizing. On one solitary occasion, I've heard him raise his voice. So it seems like a low-energy Ben Shapiro, a placid, kindly, avuncular version of him. So he's delightfully free of condescension, Professor Peterson. Now, he doesn't speak in platitudes too much. He's on a quest for the truth, and that's what academic life ought to be about. And he's constantly vindicating the right to free expression and the right to free inquiry. Now, I would have thought that would be academic ground zero, but it's a sign of the times that it seems solipsistic to even care about something as fundamental as free speech these days. These things are very much under threat, so it's frightening. This professor is said to be part of the intellectual dark web, along with Sam Harris, the previously mentioned Shapiro. I can't think who else. Well, Stephen Crowder's on the edge of that. I mean, he's not the intellectual version of it. So, of the dark web, and there are a few more, or Milo Yiannopoulos might have been part of it, the only one with a PhD is Sam Harris, besides Professor Peterson. So, Professor Peterson, he seems indifferent to economics, and other people of his ilk engage that issue a lot more. He's like a large print version of Stephen Crowder's a large print version of him. Yeah, this professor's not animated, and it's hard to work up a rage against someone who's so mannerly, so soft-spoken. But he faces many swivel-eyed foam-flecked fanatics who are very shrill, shrieking at him. And this yelling at people is unhelpful. We shouldn't just be bombarding each other with insults. Enough ad hominem. And I know I sometimes stoop to ad persona myself. But the professor, he makes the abstruse accessible. Doesn't always speak in words of a syllable, you can't always, but simplifies it as much as possible. He avoids psychobabble, and he avoids stilted lexis, because the trouble with so much scholarly discourse is its opacity. Now, because I dip into learned articles just occasionally, and my vocabulary isn't that narrow, but I have trouble sometimes. I don't mean mind being sent thumbing for the dictionary, because that's what the learning process is. And I realise there's a particular register of the technical terms which people are obliged to use to do justice to a certain subject. But sometimes these texts are just unnecessarily turgid, and people think the more impenetrable the better. It's like Gloria Steinem said, that scholarship is inversely valued to its comprehensibility. So they try to make it impossible for a layman to understand, and then think that makes it more worthwhile. So, as I said, I have trouble with this. Some of these journal articles are very heavy weather. I'm not talking about psychology so much. So I welcome people using the full breadth of the language and borrowing words from other tongues where that's apposite. It would just be tedious and to use a very narrow vocabulary, but sometimes people overdo it. So coming back to his book, 12 Rules for Life, which I have opened, and it's crystal clear. It spills onto the page like a musical score. It appears that the professor is incapable of penning an inelegant sentence, so his words are lucid and succinct. But many people say these are pseudo-profundities. There's nothing original or very revealing about what he says. But what's he best known for, apart from that book, is really having feminism and transgenderism in his crosshairs, saying they're nonsense. He takes aim at the notion of white privilege, at environmentalism, at cultural appropriation, and these are all liberal left totems. So he's bested the liberal left in some debates, and this suppurates for them. So unsurprisingly, they won't forgive him. He's beaten them at their own highbrow games sometime. Now, I don't agree with him on everything. So many people react with rage to him touching their sacred cows, never mind slaughtering their sacred cows. So the gender pay gap, and he said really that's mostly about life choices, about maternity leave, about the careers that are chosen by women more often than men, about priorities. Is money the only thing that matters? And what ambitions people have. You can have ambitions to have very long-lasting and rewarding friendships, to have more children, to spend more time with them, to do a job that you find gratifying, and things like that. It's not necessarily to climb the corporate ladder or to maximize your income. And I know about people like this. I mean, I worked for a multi-billionaire, and he was one of the most melancholic people I ever met. Or I know a guy who's got something like £20 million and he works 14 hours a day, and he really has no leisure time. The most exciting thing he'll do is go to the supermarket, almost never have to test dinner out. Some people are absolutely fixated with making money and never enjoying it. So what's the point? You're not going to live forever. I have a better quality of life than this bloke with 20 million quid, but that's by the by. Now, the fact that this professor is having a go at people who say they're transgender is richly droll, given that he has such an androgynous name as Jordan. What psychological effect did that have on him? Having a name which could easily be a girl's name. Nomen est omen, perhaps. So he's committed intellectual heresy time and again by questioning this latest fashion that boys can be girls and girls can be boys simply by saying it. Abracadabra, the magic words, and you're the opposite gender. And the whole rest of the world must dance around your whim. But as I pointed out earlier, he's changed his tune. He was more conventionally liberal left. He was a member of the New Democratic Party in Canada as a teenager. It was one of the most left-wing parties there. But there's nothing wrong with revising your opinions. It's like John Maynard Keynes said, when I change my mind, when I'm wrong, I change my mind. What do you, sir? What do you do, sir? Or when the facts change, I change my mind. That's it. So this professor's claim that Canada would imprison him for not using the gender pronouns preferred by certain so-called transgender people. This is Bill C-16, an amendment to the Human Rights Act, saying that you can be punished for anything that's offensive directly or indirectly, whether intentional or not, which seems to me to be an outrageous usurpation of people's liberty. Now, I don't know if the professor's interpretation is accurate. I've heard others say, no, that's not true, and no one's ever been sent to jail for it. It's been on the statute book for a few years now. So it's as though it's a solecism to say he when the person really is a he, and that person prefers a she, or vice versa. But surely we should judge gender by objectively verifiable criteria, something as fundamental as pudenda, something as basic as DNA or chromosomes, things that we can check, we can prove one way or the other. But like the very notion of objective truth is under attack from many directions. It's puzzling, and I feel anxious over it. So there's this trans hobby horse that some people are on. It's a fad, perhaps it'll change. He's challenged the Me Too movement, Professor Peterson. And is this being brave, or is this attention-seeking perversity? I think mainly the former. So there's incipient totalitarianism in much of the Western world, but it'll be a soft, non-violent totalitarianism. These liberals saying, we are so righteous, we've got to impose our worldview and our choice of words on everybody else, and you'll just be hounded out. If you don't do this, you'll be drummed out of your profession, things like that. So this is new think and new speak. It's Orwellian, not of the state terrorist kind. I don't resort to hyperbole. So Professor Peterson used to crowdfund a lot, but Patreon banned him for breaking its rules on politics. Don't quite get that one. What else has he written on? The psychology of architecture, biblical tales. So he says that he's, broadly speaking, a Christian. Doesn't appear to be zealous about that. Doesn't bang on about religion very much. He's a classical British liberal, according to himself, not right-wing. And he's often assailed for being a right-winger, as though that would delegitimise him. So he was disinvited to Cambridge University, having previously arranged to give a talk there. Why? He'd posed for a photo with a man who was wearing a T-shirt bearing an anti-Islam slogan. And I think, well, that's obviously no reason to ban him. Professor Peterson holds some tendentious views, and they're worth hearing. We ought to give him a fair hearing. He didn't wear that T-shirt, but even if he did, he should. Now, this really was raising the bar for satire. Cambridge University's reason for refusing Professor Peterson the chance to speak, saying that he was against the inclusive atmosphere. Have they got no self-awareness? They're excluding him for excluding people. But then you're excluding people. So Cambridge University shouldn't be allowed to have everyone speak at Cambridge University. So we've forgotten what freedom of expression is about. Now, that doesn't mean that he has a legal right to speak at Cambridge. Of course, the university is entitled to withdraw their invitation, but this wasn't a sufficiently good reason because he simply had a photo taken with somebody who wore a controversial legend on his T-shirt. So Peterson has come up with a very useful phrase, weaponizing compassion, and he's right. He says that's what left-wingers often do. So he's against authoritarianism, whether it's politically correct or right-wing, and politically correct was originally a communist thing. So sympathy for the victim or the downtrodden, is a stick with which to beat one's opponents, and if they question one's ideas. So there's a selective outrage of the left about, oh, you can't criticize this or that, but if it's a Sharia state, well, we can't say anything rude about that because that'd be racialist. So he points out that men are not entering the humanities, especially to teach. Not at university level, very, very few. And they're saying, in some decades' time, there'll be no men left lecturing humanities at this rate. Well, I think about English departments. So some of the boys I knew were, so many people doing it were female, something like 80%. The boys doing it, half of them were gay, nothing wrong with that. But straight males, maybe, straight boys just don't have much of a gift or much of a drive for this sort of thing. That's not bad. I'm not one of those people who starts with the foolish presupposition that gifts are distributed equally to both genders, to people of all sexual orientations, to people of all ethnicities. It might be that one ethnicity on the whole is better at IT, and another one on the whole is better at ballroom dancing or something. I don't know. It could be that gifts are completely equally distributed to all ethnicities, both genders and so on. I don't think so. The objective evidence would seem to militate against that. But people find it very troubling there are not enough women in STEM subjects, but they don't find it worrying there are not so many men in humanities. It doesn't bother me there are not so many men in humanities, because being male is not a choice. But why are there so few right-wing academics? Now, it's partly because they don't want to do it. They want to do other things like make more money, but also it's because of this suffocatingly far-left atmosphere of universities. Anyway, Professor Peterson, he points out the staggering hypocrisy of this exceptional indulgence which is afforded to far-left regimes, which was not accorded to Nazi Germany, and rightly so. He holds no brief for them. So he is constantly railing against the sub-Marxist drivel which pervades academia. One of these intellectual tyrannies, like in France in the 60s and 70s, unless you're a Marxist, you just weren't clever. So he notices how this oppressor versus oppressed analysis, which is borrowed from Marxism, has made its way into mainstream academia. So it's like a Marxist slow motion revolution, social justice warriors and so on. It may be called to mind what the Marxists were saying in the old days: freedom of speech is a bourgeois value, it's not a proletarian one. The very notion of free speech and so on, or academic freedom, is an illusion, it's false consciousness. So, and now people saying, the modern left saying, free speech is a cisgender, heteronormative, white, male, oppressive value that we've got to get rid of. Is capitalist for capitalist, fascist, imperialist, and all the rest of it. Now, the alt-right also oppose free expression, and they're detestable. Or, the kneeling, these American football players kneeling to protest anti-black racism. Now, I disapprove of their kneeling, but I don't think any consequences should come for them. So rightists, as far as I know, don't try to disrupt social justice warriors meetings or Black Lives Matter meetings, but leftists do try to disrupt right-wing meetings. I recall Peter Hitchens said in The Abolition of Britain, which he published in 1998, he said how Marxists took over not the factories, mines, ports and banks. No, they took over the schools, universities, television stations, publishing houses, civil servants, the courts, the police, and so on. Yes, many police officers are raging left-wingers. And that was how they affected their revolution, really a cultural revolution. And it's not made the country fully Marxist, though. So Professor Peterson says that women's studies should get no funding. I don't agree with him. I am a bit sceptical about it, but I realise that women have made a unique contribution to civilization, and women are more than half the population and were largely overlooked for a very long time. But he says that people should avoid humanities as these departments are infested by leftists. Now, they usually are infested by left-wingers, but, a left-winger could still be a fair-minded person, could still do his or her job in an unbiased manner, might be an outstanding scholar. So here I don't concur. So as I pointed out, for psychological reasons, left-wingers are more likely to be academics. It's a sort of ambiance that suits them, and they feel welcome there because they're mostly leftists there already, plus they want more government funding. And people often complaining that humanities is principally about studying dead white men. Well, if it's quite a long time ago, the people will be dead, so you can't complain about that. And obviously most literature was written beyond the lifespan of anyone still alive, or before anyone who's currently alive was born, put it like that. That's why things are pale, male and stale. Because until the 19th century, women wrote almost nothing, or had almost nothing published. Think of The Vindication of the Rights of Women, one of the first books in English, published about 1790 by Mary Wollstonecraft. And there were a few medieval nuns who published a few things. So that's why we have to be reading only male authors, because there weren't authoresses before that time. In politics, women were completely excluded from political power. So, unsurprisingly, we have to mainly look at what men did and said. And then people often twisting history to fit their preconceived nostra, like Queen Matilda. She inherited the throne in 1135, the throne of England, that she was a feminist. I don't think she had any idea what that was, but yes, she was a woman who tried to wield power. Just because she inherited it. But a wider feminist agenda, I don't think she had any of that. So the problem with that peer review of articles is then it leads to groupthink. It has to be approved by your peers. So that leads to conformity. And obviously, this status quo, the received wisdom should be challenged occasionally. We shouldn't be trying to overturn it all the time because it might be sensible. And now there's safe spaces and trigger warnings. And I even went to a comedy show at the Edinburgh Festival, which there was a trigger warning about alcohol. I think, get over yourself, grow up, all right? There are disagreeable things in lives, and you're just going to have to deal with it. People are going to have opinions that you don't hold. That's what maturity is. And university is a place of debate, often vigorous debate, and people zealously argue their point of view. And as an adult, you should be able to cope with this and handle this, and not throw a tantrum if somebody happens not to share your opinion. So this is how academic freedom is increasingly imperiled. And the professor seems to believe in radical honesty. Tell the truth, popular or unpopular. Warts and all, that's it. And people are not going to like it sometimes, but tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. So he spoke at Liberty University, which was founded by the Reverend Jerry Falwell, of unhappy and inglorious memory, and his son, Jerry Falwell Jr., is a luminary there right now. Now, the name is an oxymoron because it's really not about liberty at all. It's against academic freedom because it's a Christian fundamentalist university. You're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that, and notoriously is to ban interracial dating. It's a bit like Patrick Henry College, a place where all the academics have to have a Christian worldview, which I think is shocking, that making it a Christian fundamentalist madrasa, just constantly bombarding people with a certain belief system. So is it perhaps hypocritical of him to speak so there? I don't think so. I think he should speak to an audience wherever he can get one, which is not saying that he endorses their rules for their university. But they don't have academic freedom there either, and I think that's equally reprehensible in these places. So Peterson is vaguely Christian, as he pointed out. And he says he's opposed to identity politics, to ethnic politics of either left or right. And yet I think it's a worrying trend. The left, anti-racist, that's laudable, of course, saying, well, you can't say this because you're that race. If you're another race, you can say that, and we're going to exclude it, and we're going to have a room for only people, ethnic minority people. I think, what? What does the world come to? And not all left-wingers approve of that, of course. So the intolerance of the liberal left is worrying. I remember Robin Page, this British commentator, One Man and His Dog, presenter, UKIPper, said years ago, 2002, he said, liberal is the only one-word contradiction in terms in the English language these days. Well, it has become that because it used to be all about permitting freedom of expression, including highly tendentious views. So Professor Peterson's solicitude for his students is admirable, and the terrible hostility towards him troubles me. And he's been compared to Hitler for opposing Bill C-16, the thing about this transgender nonsense. So he appears to be a free speech fundamentalist, and I'm more or less that. I mean, obviously, if it's incitement to crime, I oppose that. But almost anything else I think should be allowed by law. That's not to say that a publishing house is obliged to publish it, or a television station is obliged to broadcast it, or a university or a school is compelled to give a platform to such a person, but it shouldn't actually be against the law. Although I still think there should be a wide degree of latitude for universities, publishing companies to publish things, universities to let people speak, even if their views are highly contentious. Come back to the only Voltaire quotation that everybody knows, as Arouet said, I disagree with you, but I defend to the death your right to say this. That I'm quoting ipsissima vox there. So Professor Peterson is a useful corrective to the increasingly militant and outraged and outrageous mania of the far left. What's next? Book burnings? As Freud said, well, this is progress. They're burning books. 200 years ago, they've been burning me. So now universities are battlefields, and academics are now the shock troops of the liberal left. You more or less can't get in there unless you sign up to this agenda. Sometimes literally sign up to a code of conduct, which is really left-wing ideology as a legal contract. So drowning out dissent in this chorus of execration is a worrying sign. We should censure but not censor. So his care for academic freedom is something to be cherished, and shame on his colleagues who don't support him in this